So Canada just blocked America's pharmaceutical supply chain, and millions of Americans are about to find out their prescription drugs come from a country their president started a trade war with. Prime Minister Carney announced at 8 a.m. this morning that Canada is suspending all pharmaceutical exports to the United States, active ingredients, finished generics, insulin intermediaries, the cross-border pharmacy pipeline effective in 72 hours. Every American pharmacy chain just got a countdown clock. Trump's response was immediate. And when I tell you what he did, the military orders, the rhetoric, the comparison to a hostile act of war against a NATO ally, you'll understand why the Pentagon pushed back, why NATO headquarters went into emergency session, and why Warren Buffett said something about the American healthcare system that stopped a room full of billionaires cold. When you hear which drugs are affected, how fast the shortages will hit, and what Buffett revealed about the pharmaceutical dependency that nobody in Washington wanted to talk about, you'll understand why healthcare analysts are calling this the most dangerous supply chain crisis since CO, and why it's about to hit a lot closer to home than any tariff fight ever has. Hit subscribe. This one is personal, so let me walk you through exactly what happened. Carney held a press conference in Ottawa at 8 a.m. Eastern. He stood behind the podium, flanked by the health minister on his left and the trade minister on his right, and his tone was something the world has come to recognize from this prime minister. Calm, measured, completely devoid of emotion. He said, Canada has been a reliable pharmaceutical partner to the United States for over 50 years. We have supplied active ingredients, manufactured generic drugs, processed insulin compounds, and provided affordable prescription access to millions of American citizens. We did this as partners, as neighbors, as allies. But we cannot continue to supply the healthcare needs of a nation whose government treats us as an economic adversary. The legal mechanism is something most Americans have never heard of. 2 months ago, Canada quietly passed the Essential Goods Sovereignty Act, emergency legislation giving the Prime Minister authority to restrict exports of goods deemed essential to Canadian national interest. It barely made the news in the United States. Nobody on Capitol Hill paid attention. Nobody in the White House flagged it. 2 months later, it just became the most consequential piece of legislation in North American trade relations. The scope of the suspension is total. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, finished generic medications, insulin intermediary compounds, bulk chemical precursors, cross-border pharmacy shipments, every category of pharmaceutical export from Canada to the United States suspended in 72 hours. Not reduced, not renegotiated, suspended. Carney didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the podium. He read the statement, took 3 questions, and left. The restraint was the point. This wasn't emotional. It was surgical. The market reaction was immediate and violent. Pharmaceutical stocks cratered within minutes of the announcement. Major generics manufacturers dropped 8 to 12% before noon. CVS, Walgreens, and Raid all issued emergency statements about supply chain contingency planning. Hospital systems across the northern United States, New York, Michigan, Minnesota, Maine, activated shortage protocols. The American Pharmacists Association released an emergency advisory listing 47 critical drugs at immediate risk of shortage. Within an hour of the announcement, hospital procurement officers across the northern half of the country were on the phone with every alternative supplier they could find. India, Ireland, Israel, the other major pharmaceutical exporting nations all got calls. Most of those calls ended the same way. We can't replace Canadian supply. Not at this volume, not at this speed. India's generic pharmaceutical industry could theoretically scale up, but the lead time is months, not days. Ireland's pharmaceutical sector is dominated by big pharma facilities producing patented brand name drugs, not the generic APIs that American manufacturers depend on. Israel's tea could redirect some supply, but not nearly enough to close the gap. The math simply doesn't work. Canada's pharmaceutical supply chain wasn't one option among many. It was the foundation. And here's the detail that makes this even more unsettling. The 72-hour window, Carney announced, isn't a negotiating window. It's a logistics window. It gives American distributors exactly enough time to place emergency orders on whatever existing inventory Canadian companies still have in transit. Shipments already on trucks, already at airports, already in the pipeline. But it's not enough time to find, qualify, and onboard alternative suppliers. 72 hours is enough to panic. It's not enough to adapt, and that asymmetry was clearly intentional. Now, this is Carney's direct response to Trump's latest tariff escalation. A 35% surcharge on Canadian manufactured goods announced the previous week, but Canada didn't do this without warning. There were 3 separate diplomatic communications over 2 months, each escalating in severity. The first was polite, the second was firm, the third was explicit. If the tariffs on manufactured goods proceed, we will restrict pharmaceutical exports. The tariffs proceeded, the restriction followed. Nobody in Washington can say they weren't warned, but the tariff escalation was just the trigger. The real reason Canada could do this, the reason this weapon exists at all, is something most Americans have never heard of. And once you understand the pharmaceutical dependency that's been building for decades, you'll understand why this crisis was always inevitable. Let's start with active pharmaceutical ingredients, because this is where the whole thing begins. APIs are the raw chemical compounds that become finished drugs, the actual active molecules that make your medication work. Without the API, there is no pill. There is no injection. There is no treatment. It's the difference between medicine and a sugar tablet. Canada is the largest processor of active pharmaceutical ingredients in North America. Facilities in Montreal, Toronto, and Calgary handle API purification and formulation for dozens of generic drugs sold in American pharmacies. Apotex, the Canadian generics giant, the largest pharmaceutical company in Canada and one of the largest generics manufacturers in the world, supplies API compounds to dozens of American drug manufacturers. When Apotex stops shipping, the American companies that buy those compounds can't make finished pills. The production lines slow, then they stop. And these aren't specialty drugs for rare conditions. These are the most prescribed medications in the United States. Metformin, 90 million American prescriptions per year for diabetes management. Lisinopril, 104 million prescriptions per year for blood pressure. Atorvastatin, 94 million prescriptions per year for cholesterol. Amoxicillin, one of the most commonly prescribed antibiotics in the country. These are the drugs that half of American adults over 50 take every single day. And the active ingredients come from Canada. Think about that. The blood pressure pill your father takes every morning. The diabetes medication your mother depends on, the cholesterol drug your doctor says you can't skip the raw ingredients for. Those pills were processed in a Canadian facility that just got a 72-hour shutdown order. But that's not even the most terrifying part, because now we need to talk about insulin. 37 million Americans have diabetes of those 8.4. 4 million require insulin to survive, not to manage symptoms, not to improve quality of life, to survive. Without insulin, a type 1 diabetic can go into diabetic ketoacidosis within days and die within weeks. This is not a lifestyle medication. This is a lifeline. Novo Nordisk's Canadian manufacturing facility in Mississauga, Ontario, produces insulin products distributed throughout the North American market. Eli Lilly sources critical intermediary compounds from Canadian pharmaceutical suppliers. Sophie's Canadian operations feed directly into the continental insulin supply chain. These 3 companies control the vast majority of the global insulin market, and all 3 have significant Canadian dependencies. Current U.S. insulin inventory sits at approximately 4 to 6 weeks of supply at normal distribution rates. If Canadian insulin exports stop for 72 hours, hospitals start rationing within 3 weeks. If they stop for 30 days, people start dying. That is not hyperbole. That is not speculation. That is what endocrinologists are telling the Department of Health and Human Services right now. The American insulin market has no rapid alternative. Domestic production capacity covers roughly 40% of demand. The rest is imported, with Canada as the primary North American source. There is no switch to flip. There is no backup supplier sitting in a warehouse waiting for a phone call. The dependency is structural, physical, and immediate. America does not make enough insulin to keep its own diabetics alive. That is the sentence that should terrify every policymaker in Washington. And until this morning, almost none of them knew it. And the cruelty of an insulin shortage is that it doesn't hit everyone equally. Wealthy diabetics will stockpile. They'll pay whatever it costs. They'll fly to Europe if they have to. But the single mother in Toledo making $38,000 a year, already paying $300 a month out of pocket for her son's insulin, she can't stockpile. She can't fly to Europe. She can't absorb a price spike. She's the one who shows up at the pharmacy and hears the words no parent of a diabetic child ever wants to hear. We're on back order. We don't know when it's coming in. That's not an economic statistic. That's a mother standing in a CVS trying not to cry. And there are 8.4 million stories like that across this country. Each one, a person whose life depends on a supply chain that just got severed by a trade war they had no voice in. Each one now counting their remaining vials and doing the math on how many days they have left. And then there's the cross-border pharmacy pipeline, the one that hits the most vulnerable Americans hardest. Millions of Americans, especially seniors, uninsured workers, and underinsured families, buy their prescription drugs from Canadian pharmacies because the exact same medications cost 50 to 80% less across the border. States like Florida, Maine, Vermont, Colorado, and New Hampshire have formal state-authorized Canadian drug importation programs. The informal market is even larger. Online Canadianese serving millions of American customers who simply cannot afford American drug prices. When Carney shut down pharmaceutical exports, he didn't just threaten hospital supply chains. He cut off the affordable drug pipeline that millions of Americans, most of them elderly, most of them on fixed incomes, depend on to afford their medication. These are people who drive to Windsor or order from Canadian pharmacies because they literally cannot afford what American pharmacies charge. A retired teacher in Bangor, Maine, making $1,800 a month on Social Security, paying $420 a month for 3 prescriptions at a U.S. pharmacy, or $86 for the same drugs from a Canadian pharmacy in New Brunswick. That's the difference between eating and not eating, between heating the house and not heating the house. And that lifeline just went dark. The cross-border pharmacy trade exists for one reason. The same pill made by the same company with the same active ingredients costs dramatically less in Canada because Canadian law allows the government to negotiate drug prices. American law does not. So Americans who can't afford American prices drive north or click a Canadian website. It's not a loophole. It's a survival strategy, and now it's gone. Now, Warren Buffett responded to all of this, and his reaction was unlike anything we've heard from him in this entire trade war saga. He was at a healthcare industry conference in Omaha. Berkshire Hathaway has significant healthcare holdings, so Buffett stays engaged with the sector. When a moderator asked him about the Canadian pharmaceutical blockade, he paused. A long pause, uncharacteristic for a man who always has a folksy anecdote or a sharp one-liner ready. And then he said this. I've talked a lot this year about capital flows and trade balances and investment confidence numbers. I'm comfortable with numbers, but this isn't about numbers anymore. This is about a 6-7-year-old woman in Dayton, Ohio, who needs insulin to stay alive and whose supply just became a bargaining chip in a tariff dispute. I don't have a Foley way to say this. That's morally obscene. Morally obscene. Those are the 2 strongest words Warren Buffett has used in the entirety of this trade conflict. Not strategically unwise, not economically irrational, morally obscene. The Oracle of Omaha, the man famous for reducing everything to balance sheets and compound interest, just made a moral judgment, and the room went silent. He continued, how did we get here? How did the most powerful country on earth end up dependent on a neighbor for its own medicine supply? I'll tell you how. We spent 30 years letting pharmaceutical companies offshore production to wherever the margins were highest. We let the supply chain stretch across borders because it was cheaper. We celebrated the efficiency. And nobody, not one president, not one Congress, not one health secretary, ever asked the question, what happens if that supply gets cut off? He paused again. Well, now we know. But then Buffett pivoted, and this is where it got pointed. Now, every president before this one managed to maintain the relationship with the country that supplies our medicine. It took a trade war to turn a supply chain vulnerability into a supply chain crisis. The vulnerability existed for decades. The crisis was manufactured in 18 months. And then he said something about Trump's response that encapsulated the entire absurdity of what was about to unfold. I heard about the president's response, the National Guard, the Defense Production Act, the rhetoric about hostile military action. And I thought, this is what happens when you don't understand supply chains. You can't point a soldier at a pharmaceutical compound. You can't invoke emergency powers and make insulin appear. The only way to get Canadian pharmaceutical exports flowing again is to sit down with Canada and negotiate. Everything else is theater. Dangerous, expensive, alliance-destroying theater. He finished with this. I've said hard things this year. I've used words like obituary and demolish, but this is different. When your trade policy starts threatening people's access to medicine, when a diabetic in Ohio or a cancer patient in Michigan becomes a casualty of a tariff dispute, you've crossed a line. And I don't know how you come back from that. That last sentence landed differently than anything Buffett has said before in previous statements throughout this trade war. He's been clinical, professorial, mournful, even cautiously hopeful. He's diagnosed capital flight, mapped economic dependency, mourned the erosion of American leadership. But I don't know how you come back from that. That's bewilderment. That's a 94-year-old man who has seen every economic cycle, every crisis, every boom and bust that American capitalism has produced over the last 7 decades, admitting he doesn't have a framework for what's happening now, not because the economics are unprecedented, supply chain disruptions happen, but because the moral dimension is unprecedented, a trade war causing pharmaceutical shortages that threaten human lives. In his experience, that has never happened between allied nations, and it shouldn't have happened now. The room at the conference, healthcare executives, hospital administrators, pharmaceutical industry leaders was completely still. Several people later described it as the moment the trade war stopped being an economic story and became a human story. Buffett had made it personal. A 6-7-year-old woman in Dayton, not a GDP statistic, not a market indicator, a person. And when the most respected capitalist in America tells a room full of healthcare billionaires that what's happening to that woman is morally obscene, something shifts. The framing changes. The conversation changes. You can't go back to talking about trade balances after that. Now, let's talk about what Trump did. Because Buffett was right. It was theater, but it was also dangerous. Trump's response came at 2:15 p.m. Eastern, 6 hours after Carney's announcement. He held a press conference in the Rose Garden, flanked by the Secretary of Defense on one side and the Secretary of Health and Human Services on the other. The staging alone told you this was going to be different. This wasn't a trade response. This was being framed as a national security response. He announced 3 actions simultaneously. First, a National Guard deployment to the northern border. 3,200 troops ordered to staging areas along the New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington state borders, the stated mission protecting American health security interests. Second, an invocation of the Defense Production Act ordering American pharmaceutical companies to maximize domestic production immediately. Third, and this is the one that sent shockwaves through every embassy in Washington, a formal diplomatic classification of Canada's pharmaceutical export ban as an act of economic warfare equivalent to a hostile military action against the American people. Think about what you just heard. The President of the United States just compared Canada, America's closest ally, the longest undefended border in the world, a NATO founding partner, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, a country that has fought alongside American soldiers in every major conflict since the First World War, to a hostile military adversary. Because Canada stopped shipping pills, the National Guard deployment was designed for one audience. Television cameras, soldiers at the border looks decisive. It looks strong. It looks like a president taking action. But it doesn't produce a single milligram of insulin. It doesn't restart a single API shipment. It doesn't unclog a single supply chain bottleneck. Military analysts pointed out within hours that there is no supply chain infrastructure to protect at the border. Pharmaceutical exports flow through commercial shipping, air cargo, and truck freight, not through checkpoints that soldiers can guard. You can't intercept a pharmaceutical supply chain disruption with camouflage and rifles. It's a photo op dressed up as a policy. Pentagon sources were reportedly deeply uncomfortable with the order. The northern border between the United States and Canada has been demilitarized since the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817, over 200 years ago. 200 years of peace across the longest undefended border in the history of the modern world. 2 centuries of mutual trust, shared defense, integrated economies, and it just got soldiers. Soldiers who can't do anything about the problem they were sent to address. The imagery alone was devastating to American credibility. Canadian media broadcast the deployment live. split screen with footage of the actual pharmaceutical facilities that supply American hospitals, clean, orderly laboratories staffed by scientists in white coats. On one side, soldiers in tactical gear guarding an empty stretch of border. On the other, the Canadian pharmacists and chemists who actually make the medicine America needs. The contrast said everything words couldn't. The Defense Production Act invocation was even more revealing, not for what it accomplished, but for what it exposed. Trump ordered American pharmaceutical manufacturers to surge domestic production. The problem is that American manufacturers can't surge production because they depend on Canadian active pharmaceutical ingredients to make the drugs. It's like ordering a bakery to make more bread while cutting off their flour supply. The oven works fine, the recipe is ready, but there's no flour, and the flour is in Canada. The Defense Production Act is a powerful tool. It was used brilliantly during CO to ramp up ventilator and vaccine production, but it works by directing existing manufacturing capability toward urgent needs. If the raw materials aren't there, they act as just a piece of paper with a presidential signature on it. And the raw materials are sitting in Canadian facilities that just received shutdown orders. Pharmaceutical industry executives reportedly explained this to the White House within hours of the announcement. One CEO of a major generics manufacturer reportedly told a senior advisor, "You're asking us to make pills without ingredients. We physically cannot do what you're ordering us to do. This isn't a capacity problem. This is a chemistry problem. The molecules we need are in Canada." The response from senior aides, according to multiple reports, the president wants action, not excuses. The people who actually understand pharmaceutical supply chains told the White House this wouldn't work. The White House told them to make it work anyway. That's not leadership, that's denial. And the Defense Production Act failure reveals something deeper about the entire America First framework. The premise of the trade war was that America is self-sufficient, that it doesn't need Canada, doesn't need foreign supply chains, can go it alone. The pharmaceutical blockade just demolished that premise in the most visceral way possible. America can't even make its own medicine without Canadian ingredients. The country that proclaimed it didn't need its neighbor can't keep its own diabetics alive without that neighbor's cooperation. If there's a more devastating rebuttal to economic nationalism, nobody has found it. And then there's the rhetoric, the hostile military action language, which may end up being the most damaging element of all. NATO headquarters in Brussels called an emergency consultation within 2 hours of Trump's statement. The concern wasn't about Canada. The concern was about what this language means for every other alliance the United States maintains. If America classifies Canada, its closest, most trusted, most deeply integrated ally, as equivalent to a hostile military actor over a pharmaceutical export dispute, what does that mean for Japan, for Germany, for Australia, for the United Kingdom? What does it mean for any country that has an economic disagreement with Washington? Japan, Germany, Australia, and the UK all issued statements within hours expressing what diplomats call concern, which in diplomatic language means alarm. But the private communications were far blunter than the public statements. According to European diplomatic sources, the German Foreign Ministry sent a classified cable to all EU member states, warning that the United States can no longer be considered a predictable partner in trade disputes, and recommending that European nations accelerate pharmaceutical supply chain diversification away from American-dependent networks. Japan's trade ministry reportedly convened an emergency meeting to assess whether Japanese pharmaceutical companies with American manufacturing operations should begin contingency planning for politically motivated supply chain disruptions. When you call your closest ally a hostile military actor over a pharmaceutical export dispute, you haven't just damaged one relationship. You've told every ally on earth that their alliance with the United States is conditional, fragile, and one trade dispute away from being classified as hostility. Every ambassador in Washington heard that message. Every foreign ministry in the world updated their threat assessments. And the cascading effect is something no National Guard deployment can contain because the damage isn't at the border. It's in the confidence of every nation that ever trusted the United States to be a rational partner. The fallout is already cascading through every system that touches pharmaceutical supply. Within 24 hours of Carney's announcement, hospital procurement systems across the northern United States activated shortage protocols. The Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, and Mass General all issued internal memos about potential drug rationing timelines. Generic antibiotic supplies 3 to 4 weeks of inventory at current usage rates. Insulin 4 to 6 weeks before rationing becomes necessary. Chemotherapy compounds with Canadian-sourced APIs, some as little as 2 weeks of supply. A cancer patient at Memorial Sloan Kettering doesn't care about tariff policy. They care about whether their next chemotherapy infusion is going to be available. And right now, the procurement team at that hospital cannot guarantee it will be. Let that land for a moment. We're not talking about trade deficits or GDP projections or stock market fluctuations. We're talking about whether a cancer patient gets their treatment, whether a diabetic gets their insulin, whether a child with an ear infection gets antibiotics. CVS announced it would immediately begin limiting prescription quantities nationwide, 3 zero-day supplies only, with all 9 zero-day refills suspended until further notice. Within hours, Walgreens activated its critical shortage contingency protocols, the first time those emergency measures have been triggered since the COVID supply disruptions. Meanwhile, state-authorized Canadian drug importation programs in Florida, Maine, and Vermont were abruptly frozen, cutting off a vital supply line that millions of Americans had quietly depended on for years. For countless seniors, this change isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a financial shock. Overnight, patients who relied on affordable Canadian pharmacies are being forced back into the far more expensive American market. The numbers are staggering. A 9 zero-day supply of brand-name insulin in the United States costs roughly $900. That exact same medication purchased legally through Canadian pharmacies costs around $120. That's a $780 difference every 3 months, a gap now landing directly on the shoulders of retirees living on fixed incomes. These aren't wealthy investors or politically connected insiders. The people hit hardest are ordinary Americans, retirees surviving on Social Security, grandparents caring for grandchildren, elderly patients managing chronic conditions. For years, many of them drove across the border or ordered medications online, simply because it was the only way they could afford to stay healthy. That fragile lifeline has now vanished, and millions of vulnerable patients have suddenly become collateral damage in a trade war they never asked for and had no voice in starting. International reaction was swift. NATO convened an emergency consultation and issued a joint statement urging immediate de-escalation and diplomatic resolution. Canada's ambassador to NATO reportedly told the session that Canada is not a hostile actor but a sovereign nation responding to economic pressure. If the United States wants pharmaceutical exports restored, he said, the path forward is simple: negotiation, not militarization. Even deeper tensions are now rippling through the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the highly sensitive intelligence sharing partnership linking the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Intelligence officials privately described the strain as unprecedented. Australia's Prime Minister publicly warned that militarizing a trade dispute with one of your closest allies is not the behavior of a reliable partner. For decades, every alliance America built after World War II rested on a basic assumption: the United States does not treat its allies like enemies. Yet critics argue that this confrontation has crossed that line, not with adversaries like Russia or China, but with Canada, America's closest neighbor and longest-standing ally. And every government watching this dispute has taken note. Back home, the political backlash has been immediate. Republican senators from border states New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington were inundated with calls from worried constituents suddenly realizing their medications could soon become scarce. Senator Lisa Murkowski released a statement condemning the National Guard deployment as a misuse of military resources that does nothing to solve the real problem. In Michigan, 3 Republican members of Congress held a joint press conference demanding urgent negotiations with Ottawa. One of them summarized the crisis bluntly: my constituents don't need soldiers at the border. They need insulin at their pharmacy. Those are 2 very different problems, and they require very different solutions. Even commentators on Fox News struggled to defend the administration's strategy. During a tense live interview, one anchor pressed a White House spokesperson with a simple question: how exactly do National Guard troops at the border help a diabetic in Iowa get her insulin? The spokesperson pivoted to national security talking points. The anchor asked again. The spokesperson pivoted again. The clip went viral not because of the question, but because no clear answer ever came. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels between Ottawa and Washington, D.C. remain technically open, but officials describe them as effectively frozen. Canada has made its position unmistakably clear. Negotiations cannot proceed while National Guard troops remain deployed along the border. Prime Minister Mark Carney has outlined straightforward conditions for restoring pharmaceutical exports. First, a full rollback of tariffs on Canadian manufactured goods. Second, withdrawal of the National Guard deployment. If those two steps happen, Canada says pharmaceutical shipments could resume within 48 hours. In other words, the deal on the table is simple. Remove the tariffs, withdraw the troops, and the medicine starts flowing again. But accepting that deal would require Donald Trump to acknowledge that the tariffs triggered the crisis, something critics say the president has repeatedly refused to do. His political brand has long been built on projecting strength and refusing to back down, and throughout the trade conflict, every potential off-ramp has reportedly been rejected for the same reason. Accepting compromise means admitting error. So hospitals quietly prepare for rationing, pharmacies restrict prescriptions, seniors begin calculating whether they can afford their medications at full American prices. Endocrinologists start planning which patients receive insulin first if supply falls below critical levels. Oncologists begin difficult conversations with cancer patients about whether their next chemotherapy treatment can be guaranteed. And the clock keeps ticking. This isn't another abstract trade war story about factories, tariffs, or shipping routes. It's about medicine, your medicine. The prescriptions in your cabinet, the pills in your parents' weekly organizer, the treatments your family might depend on in an emergency. A trade dispute that started with tariffs on steel has now reached directly into America's medicine cabinets. The question now facing Washington is stark. How long before the warnings turn into empty pharmacy shelves? Because soldiers at a border cannot force a sovereign nation to ship medicine. And if the National Guard deployment accomplishes nothing, the real question becomes the one Warren Buffett raised but could not fully answer. When trade policy begins threatening people's access to life-saving medicine, how do you come back from that? The tariffs were meant to make America stronger. Instead, this pharmaceutical blockade has exposed just how vulnerable the system has become. Canada didn't fire a single shot. They didn't send troops. They simply stopped shipping medicine. And now the most powerful country on earth is racing against the clock to figure out how to keep millions of its own citizens healthy without the help of the neighbor it chose to fight. 72 hours. The countdown has already begun.